I'm very pleased to be with you today to make this introduction to European climate policy. So my name is Iva Ganev. I'm from Bulgarian origin. I have a legal background, so this may explain some of the perspectives that I'm going to take during this presentation. And so I'm coming from Euroliage. It's a European association which has been in place for more than 20 years and has huge experience from industry. But of course, as Hans explained, we will have an objective view today. But enough for me, because we have a quite packed program today. So let's get started. You will see that this session will contain five main parts. So first of all, a kind of short vademecum on EU climate policy, then introduction through its history to understand its perspective. Then what does climate policy mean at European level itself internally, and what is also the European Union vision of climate policy at global level, which is playing a huge role, and then some perspectives for development. But let's start now with what I called the vademecum. I wanted to make a short foreword on the decision-making structure of the European Union because I see that some of you do not come from Europe, and I don't know until up to what extent you have this knowledge. So I'm not going into details here, but I just wanted to mention to you that you can see that the European Commission has a central role in European decision-making, and this is quite peculiar, and it is very important since the European Commission has the initiative of legislative proposals, and it is also the executive body of the European Union. So it's quite interesting to understand how this all works. Then, what is the role of science in decision making at European level? Well, if we talk specifically about European climate policy, science has a huge role to play indeed. And actually the European climate policy is mostly based on the works of the what is called UNFCCC. I'm sure you're familiar with that, the Framework Convention on Climate Change under the United Nations. But I'm saying here that the role of science is relative. Well, the European Union endorses almost automatically the works of the UNFCCC and also the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their recommendations. And actually, it is trying to translate quite automatically also the different targets set at international level from the KYOTO Protocol, for instance, at European level. But lately, and namely in the assessment report number 5 of the IPCC, there is no specific target for the European Union anymore. So it means that there is some small change there. And of course, the European Union has its scientists who can, of course, and who do run their own modeling exercises. But most of all, what is important also to understand is that there is a matter of political agreement. So it's not only science-based. Political agreements are very, very, very important. And then we often talk about the role of lobbies at European level. They are really a lot of them in Brussels, and actually I'm part of one of them. Well, they are really part of the game. And for climate-related issues, we deal with green NGOs, with the power sector, which is also quite powerful, and manufacturing industries. And we all have a word to say and trying to improve and to get an overall balanced policy at European level. So let's now cut into the flesh of the European climate policy. What is the objective of European climate policy? Well, it's twofold. First of all, it's, I'm quoting, preventing dangerous climate change. This is a strategic priority for the European Union. It means, first of all, cutting greenhouse gas emissions. But it means also, and very importantly, encouraging other nations and regions to do likewise. And this is a very, very important part of European climate policy, as we are going to discuss this afterwards. And then the second point is the adaptation. Well, we will not deal with this one today. We will only deal with the prevention of climate change or even the fight against climate change. What is dangerous? Climate change? Well, as I said before, the European Union is endorsing international targets. And here, namely, it's the limitation of temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial times. It means around 1.2 degrees above today's levels. So the path towards this is, first of all, to stop the growth in global greenhouse gas emissions by 2020 at the latest, and this is at global level, then reduce them by half by 2050, and of course continue the reduction thereafter. And when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, we talk about carbon dioxide, nitrous oxides, and PFCs, perfluorocarbons. So, what is the coverage of European climate policy? There are many issues covered actually by European climate policy. And it's interesting and important to understand that there is a huge link to other policies. Environment policy, of course, this is quite obvious. Energy policy also, but it means also transport policy. You can see that there's a mention of agriculture, buildings. So it's really a whole set of policy, and actually the European Commission is talking about mainstreaming of climate policy through all the other European policies. This is quite interesting to understand. And then you can also guess that innovation has a huge role to play, and that we are striving to low carbon technologies, for instance, carbon capture and storage. But we will go into a little bit more details later on. As I said, the global evolution of climate change policy is something very important for the European Union. First of all, it has inspired its own European climate policy from the international bodies, and it is still interacting very much with different international organizations, for instance, the UNFCCC, but also the IEA, which is also quite important, for instance, for energy efficiency policy. It is working together hand in hand with the OECD, and of course the OECD is providing some analysis and recommendations on policy which are often taken on board by the European institutions. And of course the World Bank is also quite active on issues such as carbon market, price evolutions, etc., etc. But this is not only to this extent that there's the interaction. It is also, of course, going in the other direction, since the European Union wants really to have a very important position at global level. It is what we could call a real ardent fighter against climate change. And in the paradigm there is to say that we cannot afford waiting, and if it is a matter of cost, it would cost much more to have to adapt to climate change than to try to fight it. And there is also another element, is that we can afford this fight financially speaking, because we are living here in the European Union in a quite rich region, so we can afford to carry on this fight. And the European Union's ambition is quite clear. It wants to be the world leader in the fight against climate change. And it has achieved at least something so far, which is to be speaking with one voice in the latest international conferences on climate. And you know that now we are 28 member states, and there are also kind of satellites around, such as Norway, Iceland, etc. So it is quite an achievement there. A very short word on the history of the European climate policy, because it's really interesting and important to understand where we are coming from. So the origins, as I said, it's the inspiration from the international level. And it's also very interesting to note that progressively there's what I call Europeanization of environment policy, environment of course covering, for instance, climate change issues. And actually, the reflections at the European Union level have followed quite closely the reflections at international level. The first official document has been produced in 86. It's a parliamentary resolution on climate change. And you can see that still today the European Parliament is very active and really wants to fight against climate change. What is also very interesting is that a few months before the establishment of the IPCC, the European Commission has published a communication, so a non-binding document called the greenhouse effect and the community. So the reflection was already there, and the first political agreement to stabilize emissions has taken place in 1990. The European Commission has put into place different programs. For instance, the European Climate Change Program, which is a platform to implement the Kyoto Protocol. But you will see in a few moments that the European Union even goes beyond this. And now about the choice of instruments. In the early 90s, the European institutions started discussing about should we put in place a carbon tax or should we try to have a cap and trade system. And this was already acknowledging the principle to give a price to carbon as a means to fight climate change. And of course, the European Union, as you know, puts in place a cap and trade scheme. It is the European Emissions Trading Scheme, which emerged in 2003 and kicked off in 2005. So now let's move into the essence of the European, what are called here, internal climate policy, to distinguish the European level itself from the global level. So if we look at the share of European greenhouse gas emissions per sector, here we have data from 2012. It is the latest submission. We can see which sectors are the main actors, the main emitters, and which sectors have subsequently been targeted by European policy. So energy supply and energy use are very, very important. And this explains that the European Emissions Trading Scheme is applying a specific, quite strict regime on these sectors. But you can see that also transport is an important target to have there. And you will see in a few moments that there's a quite developed policy on transport and on the reduction of emissions from the transport sector. So what does European climate policy look today in a nutshell? What we have is legislation, binding legislation until 2020. And this is based on what is called the 20-20-20 targets by 2020. So the first target is 20% emissions reduction by 2020. This is compared to 1990 levels. And it's important to note that it has been accompanied by a 30% conditional target, meaning that the European Union, at the time of the adoption of this policy in 2009, said, well, if other important regions in the world move into the same direction, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, then the European Union will scale up its ambition and move from 20% target to a 30% target. Well, it did not happen like that, but this shows the level of ambition of the European Union. Then the second 20% target is the share of renewable energies in the overall energy mix by 2020. And the third target is to improve energy efficiency by 20%, also by 2020. And then on the bottom of this slide, you can see that the European Union has also a quite ambitious vision until 2050. This is not written in stone, this is not legislation, this is not binding, but it is a political agreement. And you can see that the red line with business as usual, we would reach around 60% of emissions, so 40% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 compared to 1990. And this figure of 60% is quite important to bear in mind. But what is the European Union target? is to achieve a reduction of at least 80% or even 95%, meaning almost full decarbonization by 2050. And you can see here again the sectors that are being targeted, and we were talking about the power sector. You can see that it is aiming at full decarbonization by 2050. So an ambitious policy indeed, and it needs an ambitious and also well-designed instruments to bear this issue. I want here to mention that, as Hans explained previously, there are going to be dedicated modules on most of the elements of this presentation. So this is really an introduction. I'm not going into the details, but for instance, on the EU ETS, energy efficiency, renewable energies, etc., there are going to be dedicated sessions, dedicated modules, if you are interested in going further, deeper in the issues. So the main instrument of the European climate policy is the EU ETS, the Emissions Trading Scheme. Its objective, of course, is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, but through the fact that it's putting a price on carbon, its objective is also to incentivize the low carbon technologies. And for instance, to simplify all this is to say that those who emit greenhouse gas emissions have to pay something, which would be then used for instance, for the development of renewable energies. So this is a cap and trade system, meaning that we have a limit on our emissions, which is decreasing each year. And within this limit, the companies, the participants, the operators can buy and sell, can trade their emission allowances in order to comply with this cap. This is the implementation of the polluter pays principle, and actually the trading is taking place through auctioning, with some exceptions for specific industries which are, said, exposed to the carbon leakage risk. And there's, of course, also monitoring, reporting, and verification mechanism in order to ensure the compliance with the legislation. Now, the coverage is quite large. It's around 11,000 power plants and manufacturing plants today in 28 EU member states, but also it has been opened to the European Economic Area, so Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway are also part of this. And since 2012, aviation is also part of the EU ETS. So in total, around 45% of EU emissions are covered by this policy, and you can see that this is quite large. So we have different trading periods. What's interesting to note here is that the current trading period, which has started in 2013, is, let's say, the real thing. Before we were quite learning by doing, expanding little by little. Today it's really auctioning is the principle. We have a EU-wide cap on emissions, and we have to comply with this one. If we look at what the EU ETS has achieved so far, so here we have the latest estimates from the European Commission of October last year, and we can see that, you remember, we have this goal of 20% emission reductions by 2020 compared to 1990 level, where, well, we will certainly exceed this target, because the projections show a reduction of 21% of emission reduction by 2020, so completely in line with the ETS directive. One of the targets of the European climate policy was to reach a decoupling between economic activity and greenhouse gas emissions. And this, as you can clearly see from the second graph on the right, has been achieved, because the evolution of GDP has been decoupled from the evolution of greenhouse gas emissions. So this means a progressive decarbonization, at least up to a certain extent, of the European economy. We often discuss about the role of the economic and financial crisis over, for instance, the achievement of the targets for emissions reduction by 2020, and of course the reduction of the industrial output has a role to play there. but it has to be balanced because at the same time Germany decided to shut up its nuclear plants, and the US shale gas revolution caused the flooding of coal of US coal on the European market. So it has to be really balanced. So in a nutshell, this crisis has played a role in the reduction of emissions in Europe, but not so wide. So if we look now at the reduction drivers under the EU ETS, I wanted to show to you this graph because it's quite interesting. It's coming from the European Environment Agency, which is regularly analyzing, and here it has quantified the impacts of the decomposition factors affecting the CO2 emissions and the reduction. And here they have targeted the fossil fuel consumption, and actually CO2 emissions from fossil fuels combustion account for around 80% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in the European Union, so it's quite representative. And so here you can see the decomposition by different factors: population, GDP per capita, primary energy intensity, and carbon intensity of primary energy use. And what we see is that in the first period covered here, 2009-2008, the emissions from the fossil fuels have decreased by 3.3%. And then they have further decreased in the following years until 2012 by 9.2%, which is quite important reduction. And how do we explain this? Well, there are three factors. First of all is the fact that the primary energy intensity of the European economy has decreased significantly, and this has happened among others through energy efficiency improvements. Secondly, the carbon intensity, as you can see, of primary energy use has also decreased, and here the renewable energies have a role to play. And then, as we were discussing just before, the effect of growth, well, it is contrasted, of course, with regard to emissions reduction driven by the other factors. And actually, an analysis from the European Commission has shown that the economic crisis contributed to less than half of the reduction observed during the 2008-2012 period, so the second period on this graph. And I quite like this graph because it is really showing how everything is interacting together. It's really quite interesting to realize this. So the ETS has achieved lots of important things and has helped the European Union move forward towards decarbonization. But it still has several challenges to overcome. Well, it's the first large-scale cap-and-trade system put into place at global level. So it, of course, has made some mistakes. There are some design issues which need to be solved. And for instance, the economic crisis that we are just talking about has had a very large impact also on this system. So first of all, one challenge is the low flexibility. Actually, if we talk about this economic crisis, it has led to reduction in industrial output and also in a reduction of energy consumption, of course. So it has resulted in a surplus of allowances on the market. And of course, market mechanisms are made so that the carbon price has decreased, sometimes significantly decreased, and therefore the second role of the EU ETS has become quite difficult to play, and this role was, as you can recall, to incentivize low carbon technologies. So here there's a kind of challenge to overcome, and the credibility of the system has been harmed, first of all by these issues that I have just explained, but also by the fact that the European Commission has intervened in the market with some quick fixes, and actually most of the actors at European level have, for a reason or another reason, criticized such interventions, and also there are some doubts about the ability of the EU ETS as it is designed today to reach its long-term objectives. But good news, the European Commission is coming with a new proposal to improve the EU ETS in a few months. So maybe we will have some solutions to this. On this graph here, you can see what I was talking about, the surplus, which has caused in return a real sharp decrease of carbon prices, and actually this is a bit problematic today in the European ETS system. So if we move further to renewable energies, here we have also a very good policy at European level. We have a directive from 2009, which is actually the instrument to fulfill this 20% target by 2020 for renewable energies. This is being done through individual national targets. So each country, each member state of the European Union has received its own targets depending on certain criteria, of course differing from member state to member state. And also this renewables energy directive contains a part of renewable sources of energy in the transport sector, and there's a 10% target by 2020. And where do we stand today? Well, the latest data in March this year, so really a few weeks ago, showed that we have reached 15% of renewable energies in the global EU energy mix. So this is quite an achievement also. Then, if we move to energy efficiency issue, here we have also a quite comprehensive directive from 2012, which is actually making the link between other different directives which have been put in place in the European Union in the previous years, and this is the directive which is bearing the 20% target by 2020. Here, what is interesting with energy efficiency is the 20% target is not binding, but its achievement is to be made through binding measures, and again they are declined per member state. And we have achieved already quite significant improvements of energy efficiency, as we were saying already before, since we can count around 20% improvement of energy efficiency in the last let's say 20 years, since 1990. Of course, we are now above 20%. Since 1990, and you can see on the right bottom part the graph, which is showing the reduction of energy intensity per sector. So the industry, household, transport, tertiary, and the average, of course, in blue. So the reduction is quite clear. It's quite sharp. But looking at the picture above from NASA, the beautiful picture of Europe by night, maybe there's some more improvement to be made. But I also wanted to mention something quite important. Actually, the energy efficiency policy at European level today has a special importance because energy efficiency is seen as a solution to several problems. A very important issue faced by the European Union today is the security of energy supplies. Of course, this is explained by the geopolitical context with the Ukrainian crisis. And as the European Commissioners like to say, the best energy is probably the one that you do not consume, because of course you do not have to depend on someone else to have access to this energy. And by the way, you don't have to pay for this. And this solves also the issue of high energy prices and high energy costs in the European Union. And of course, last but not least, there is also a corollary, which is a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But lately it has been energy efficiency has a little bit been kept in the shadow in the very last months. For instance, the Juncker investment plan is not specifically dedicating funds to energy efficiency, and actually relevant actors in the sector doubt that this plan will be helpful to energy efficiency. And also the European Council conclusions from March, so a little bit more than 3 weeks ago, barely mentions energy efficiency, although it is a very important part of European energy and climate policy. So let's see in the future how this all develops. But in any case, energy efficiency is a very important part, as I was saying, of European climate policy. Then if we move to another topic, transport, we saw at the beginning of this part of the introduction to European climate policy that transport holds an important share in European greenhouse gas emissions, and it is responsible of 20% of the CO2 emissions and 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So it is a sector to be tackled by climate policy, and the European institutions have done so through several pieces of legislation. And maybe the most interesting one is the white paper on transport, which has been published in 2011. And here we are talking about cutting carbon emissions in transport by 60% by 2050. Actually, in transport, if you recall the graph of the vision by 2050, we have not yet reached the peak, but there is real progress, and the European institutions are really dealing with this specific issue on transport. And then I wanted to mention the role of innovation, because its role has increased over the years. The European Commission has had programs since the 1980s to co-fund research and development issues, but today we are more talking about innovation, because we want to move to real low carbon technologies that can be put quite quickly on the market, and quite quickly also can have effects on decarbonisation. So the role has increased over the years, and today we consider that innovation is necessary to achieve the ambitious EU targets, because with current technologies, actually it is not really possible to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to the extent of the ambition of the European Union. So I have put here a picture which is quite old. It is dated 2009, but it is still quite important. It's quite a reference actually in the sector, to show the different abatement possibilities, and the most cost efficient ones beyond business as usual, of course, by 2030. So as you could see in this part, I have not covered all the different issues. I have not talked about shale gas, although it has had importance on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, for instance. But this is an introduction, and I don't have the ambition to cover all the different issues. I really wanted to cover the main ones here. So now the next part is about the European Union vision of climate policy at global level. As I was saying, it is quite an important one, and starting from the European implication in the KYOTO protocol, and of course the subsequent exercises to try to find a successor to the Kyoto Protocol. So this protocol has been approved by the European Union in 2002, and at that time the European Union comprised 15 member states. And you can see on this graph the path that has been followed and the projections until 2020, which is actually the period of the Kyoto Protocol. And over the first period of the Kyoto Protocol, you can see here 2008 to 2012, the European Union has overachieved its target on the Kyoto Protocol. And actually the European Union targets that it has adopted for itself already go beyond the commitments under the Kyoto Protocol. And so the next period is the one which we are in now. It's 2013 to 2020. And now we are 28 member states, and Iceland is also included here. So Europe is really on track to overachieve its targets within the Kyoto Protocol. But how do things go at global level? Here um, it's an illustration of the evolution of CO2 emissions at world level, and this is per different sectors. And the years chosen here are 1990 because you have understood that this is the baseline for the compliance, for instance, for the European Union, but also in the discussions at international level. 2005 also because in the international discussions it is also a baseline period. For instance, the United States mostly referred to 2005 and not to 1990. And 2013 is the last year for which we have reliable data. So you can see, of course, that the most important source for CO2 is fuel combustion. And well, I'm sorry, the caption, it's in million tons of CO2. It has disappeared here, but you can see that all sources of CO2 emissions have increased here, except maybe for agriculture, which has remained quite stable. And the explanation behind this is the development and growth of the so-called emerging economies. And this has really to be taken into account at global level. If we look now at the evolution of CO2 emissions from several major countries, and here I have selected the European Union, China, the United States, Russia, and India. You can see, well, first of all, that there's a small decrease for the European Union, but it has been continued over time. And you can also see that, for instance, the increase of CO2 emissions for China is quite significant. So this means new challenges ahead, and new challenges because the reduction made in one place on the planet have to find a counterpart in another place on the planet to achieve some balance. Otherwise, we are going to increase yet again and again. Now, if we look at three of these countries, China, the United States, and the European Union, and still with regard to the same emissions per sector, you can see that in China the increase is really is really self-elegant. And by the way, the gas combustion part will continue to increase due to the different contracts that have been signed, for instance, last year by China. So here the increase is quite sharp. For the United States, if we take 2005, we can see that this was the highest level among the three reference years taken here. So now the United States are on the part of really decreasing their emissions. And then if we take the European Union, it has been actually an early mover compared to the others. And if we look into the CO2 emissions per capita, well, in 2010, China was, of course, following this increasing path. It was at 6.2 metric cubes of CO2 per capita. The United States, the real champions of CO2 emissions per capita, were at 17.6 metric cubes of metric tons of CO2 emissions. And the United States, the European Union, sorry, was at 7.4, and actually today we can say that China has gone beyond this level, and so the emissions per capita in the European Union have become even lower than the ones in China. But what does this mean for the European Union's position? So we say that the European Union wants to be a leader in the fight against climate change at global level. But the balance there is difficult to find because such an ambitious climate policy also puts some pressure on the European Union. So we want to really take the best from it, be really at the top of innovation, be it in renewable energies, in energy efficient technologies, but at the same time, we are talking about high energy prices. We are talking about competitiveness problems for the European-based industry. And we have to find investment for innovation. So this is sometimes a complicated balance to find. And if we look at the past few years, has the EU been a leader so far? Yes, but by its ambition. It's very clear that the European Union is really an early mover. It's really ambitious with regards to its emissions reduction targets, for instance. But it has not really managed to be as influential as it wanted to be, because the strategy there was to lead by example, and there was this 30% conditional goal by 2020, which was actually designed for the negotiations under the Copenhagen conference, international conference in 2009. But in the end, to put it quite bluntly, the European Union was out of the room when the negotiations were taking place. So maybe a different strategy could be envisaged for the future. And this is a good transition to say that at the end of this year we have the international conference to take place in Paris. So the European Union has put forward a month and a half ago its vision, and we are talking about at least 60% greenhouse gas emissions reductions below 2010 levels by 2050. And this 60% echoes somehow the 60% business as usual figure that the European Union would reach if it did not implement such ambitious policies, but of course compared to 1990. And the criteria here of the European Union are quite strict. But there are still some major issues to try to overcome, for instance, the importance for financing for developing countries, and also technology transfer issues. And this can be, let's say, agreement stoppers. But what is interesting is that the European Union is really ambitious about this agreement in Paris, and actually doesn't call it an agreement. It already calls it a protocol as the KYOTO protocol. So what are actually the perspectives for development of the European climate policy? Well, at European level, we have already targets set at least at political level by 2030 and by 2050. And as I said before, we have this 80 to 99% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions to compared to 1990 levels. And this is through domestic reductions alone. So it means almost full decarbonization. And actually, a kind of milestone is 2030 with 40% greenhouse gas emissions reduction, and this has been agreed at political level. So this is important to know that this is really the way that we are going to. And what does the EU represent actually in the global picture? Well, 2 years and a half ago, in 2012, the EU was responsible for around 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And if we follow the projections, we are going to be responsible of around 6% of emissions for 2020. And actually, this share is falling because Europe is domestically reducing its greenhouse gas emissions through its ambitious efforts. But at the same time, as I was saying before, in other parts of the world, especially emerging economies, the emissions increase. So, and by the way, in 2020, almost 2/3 of the world's emissions will come from developing or emerging economies. So can can the European Union change the global picture by itself? It seems quite complicated here. And what is the final goal, if I may call it like that? It's to have a global carbon market. But if we look at the map today, we are not really yet there. So we have still this discussion at global level between carbon taxes. In some places in the world, carbon taxes have been put in place. So how to combine this? Well, the European Union wanted to move forward to a linkage with the Australian ETS a few years ago. But as you can see now, the latest policy of Australia is to have no carbon market. So it is quite a long path there, and we will probably reach a global carbon market one day. But until then, we have to really try to give this impulse at global level, and to try to find common positions, and something that is satisfactory for everyone. So this Paris Conference of Parties under the United Nations. We know that climate protection is really a consensual topic, but there are, however, some elements which could undermine the success that Europe wishes for this conference. And for instance, if we analyze the intended nationally determined contributions which have been put forward by several countries, we can see that well, the European Union one, we know what it represents. It's 40% emissions reduction by 2030. But for China, for instance, they say that they have not yet reached their peak. It would be around 2030, and there's a lot of might, etc. in the intended contribution. So it's complicated to draw a clear picture around this. The US reduction goal actually it is to reach the Kyoto targets that have been imposed to the United States, but by 2025, but maybe also by 2030, we don't know exactly. And it was a surprise to see that Russia published also an INDC, but they are saying something really quite unclear, and they are putting also forward the same target as they had for 2020. So what can we really expect from this Paris conference? Well, to conclude, we see that we have a quite ambitious policy at European level with many achievements, but the balance there is really difficult to strike. And the EU ETS suffers from what we could call the prototype syndrome. And actually, the EU ETS has served as basis for the development of other emission trading schemes around the world. But maybe it's time now for the European Union to look at its own flaws, mistakes, and to try to correct them. And as I was saying, we are expecting in a few months from now new legislative proposals. So maybe we will have the answer to these issues. And then the European Union wants to be a leader at global level. It is overachieving its Kyoto targets, but it is quite isolated. The strategy used so far, the leading by example strategy, did not work. So are we going to have an agreement or a protocol or something coming out from Paris? Most likely yes, but it should be a political agreement. And now everything in the future will depend on actually the interpretation that the European institutions will give to this agreement or protocol or whatever it is reached in Paris. And this will be also very important and determining for the future of European climate policy. So thank you for your attention.